What if you could sit down with someone who's been running a design agency for 8 years and they would tell you every single secret about how they run their business? Most creative projects have the same 5 stages, but I want to go behind the scenes and show you everything that actually goes into making a design agency run smoothly. Before we actually start, I just wanted to talk about why I think it's such a good idea to have a really clear design process. First off, you can templatize all your work, so it makes everything faster and easier. You also start becoming really good at spotting questions that often come up, and you can start to prevent those things from becoming an issue. You also become a lot more confident and calmer, and I think this is especially important if you have imposter syndrome or sometimes don't feel so confident about your design process, because if you have a clear process to follow, then that little voice that is inside of your head can be a little bit more quiet, because you've seen that it works before. You can also charge a more accurate price because you can start to see how long a project will actually take. Because you can plan better, you can take on more work, which means you will make more money. And lastly, you can also save a lot of money because you avoid scope creep. And that is something that can be a really big part of running a design business. Scope creep is just any time when you have to do more work than you actually planned for, but you can't charge for it. So let's get into part 1. Everything that actually happens before you start the project. The very first step is the initial conversation, and this is just to make sure that you and your client are a good fit for each other. You want to make sure that you ask about things like timelines, budgets, and if they're looking for a specific style, because this can really help determine if you will be the right fit for them. In the same way, you also want to make sure you ask questions to show if they're a good fit for you. So for me, for example, I really care about my clients working seriously on their sustainability goals and that they're not trying to do any greenwashing. This call is usually quite quick, like 20 to 30 minutes, and I like to prepare some questions that I'm going to ask beforehand. For a lot of the projects, these questions are the same and you start to get in the groove of which questions to ask. But if they have a specific requirement, like maybe they really want illustrations or maybe they have an app that they want the brand to be integrated into, then I might have some specific questions as well. The goal here is to gather as much information as we can that will be useful when we create the proposal, so that we can really tailor that proposal and make it a really convincing and good fit for our clients. Here are some typical things that I like to ask. What does your business do? And who is your target audience? What does your current brand right now look like? And are there parts that you maybe like or don't like that you would like to change? I also want to ask if they have a timeline and budget. And if they don't, I'd like to suggest roughly what it would look like. So maybe I can have a range of prices for, let's say, the budget, or say, okay, well, it typically takes 6 to 8 weeks to do a branding project, just so that we can know that we're a good fit and you're not spending lots of time creating a proposal for a client that just can't afford you or is looking for something different. If you notice that the price is too high for them, what you can do is either you can say, okay, well, we're not a good fit, or you can see if you can talk to them about changing the scope of the project. Maybe they've asked for lots of social media templates and you could actually just remove that and do that at a later stage and just focus on the core branding, for example. I also like to mention my general process, so the different stages we're going to go through, because this makes sure that my client is aware of what's expected from them, what they can expect from me, and it makes it much easier for them if they need to prepare any files or, let's say, check for testimonials or their website traffic to see if there's anything I need to create the brand and do my research. The very last thing I like to ask in this meeting is if I missed something. So sometimes client might bring up something super interesting that you just never knew to ask. And this is super helpful when we're creating that proposal. And sometimes they just say, no, you covered everything. And in that case, I think it is kind of a way for your client to feel like, okay, this designer has really asked me everything. They really do know what they're doing. So either way, you have a really good benefit from just asking that simple question, did I miss something? At the end of the call, I always give a date when I'm going to send the proposal so they know exactly what to expect. And it might sound something like this. Thank you so much for your call today. I'm really excited to get started. I'm going to put together a proposal and send that over to you on Tuesday. It's going to have the timeline, the project budget, and some examples of my work. Does that sound okay? So that can be how you can put it to your client, for example. So now that we have all this key information and we know that the client is a good fit, it's time to create the proposal. I have a template for this, and that makes it so much easier and quicker to just focus on the sections that I need to customize for this specific client. And I don't have to focus on sections like about us or talking about, for example, formatting or designing the proposal. So having a template is a really good idea. To make life a little bit easier for you, I've actually created a template that's completely for free that you can download as well. So I'll make sure to add that down in the description. I thought it might be helpful if I walk you through my actual proposal template in an example so that you can see the sections that I include and why I choose to include them. The first section is a simple cover page with a client name and what the project is, and an index page. And this is just to make sure that I'm giving my client an overview of exactly what they can expect to see in this proposal. Here's also a great opportunity to put any limitations, like you could put something that this proposal is only valid for 30 days, for example, to make sure that your client doesn't come back like 2 years later and is asking for the price that you charged 2 years ago. If you want your pricing or some of your other details to be private, you can also make sure that you add something like, this proposal is confidential, so please don't share it with other companies. Next up is the section that I usually put the most time into, and this is the brief section. Here I have 2 sections within it, so I have basically what they're looking for, and then I have my approach. And this is just a way to show that I have listened, I know exactly what they're looking for, and I'm giving a little bit of expertise here. Since we haven't been paid yet and we don't know if the project's going to go forward, I don't want to suggest any actual design decisions, but let's say I know that I'm working with a startup that is going to have VC funding. Then I might say something like, we want to make sure that the brand is going to work equally for customers, investors, and partners, for example. This just shows that you're adding a little bit of expertise to the project and you're customizing this proposal for them. You're not just sending something that is very generic. Next up is work samples, and this is basically hand-picked projects that I have worked on that I think would be really relevant to them. So if you worked with the same industry, let's say a lot, maybe you work with realtors a lot, then you could put other projects that you've done for realtors to show, I know the space and look at all this amazing work that I've done for these companies. But maybe this is a new niche where you haven't done anything, or maybe you're really new to design and you don't actually have something in the same industry. That's totally fine. What I usually do then is I add something where the deliverables are very similar, and I use the description of the project, like the challenge and the solution, to bring out things that are helpful to them. So maybe this client is looking for design of social media templates or proposals, and you've done that for another client. And then you can say, this is how we approach social media templates for this other company. This shows that you have experience and that you really think about the projects that you design. You're not just putting something beautiful out there, but there's a strategy behind it. Next up, I dive into the project scope. And if there are multiple parts to the project, like let's say a brand, and we're also looking for a web design, then I like to have 1 page for each. The more details that you get here, the less problems you will have in a project. Basically, you want to get really nitty-gritty here and outline exactly what's included and what's not included. This will help you build a great relationship with your client because you won't have any misunderstandings or confusing moments in the project. You also avoid a lot of scope creep because everything is just really outlined. For example, if I'm doing branding, I might make a list of items that are included that are deliverables, like logo design, colors, photography style, illustration, or icon design. But I also like to include things that are a little bit less about a deliverable and more of a feature. So for example, I organize all of the different files for both print and digital use in different folders, and I share that with the client so that they have everything on the cloud and everything is easy to find and clearly organized. So that's something that I could bring up as well. I can't stress enough how important it is that you're really clear on this page. Let's say you're designing templates. How many templates? For what platforms? If you're offering revisions, how many rounds of revisions? Because this page is really going to help you as you move through the project. Next up, we have the project timeline, and I like to do a couple different things here. I know some people really like to put the actual dates because it makes it a lot easier to plan, but what I've noticed is that there are so many factors that can impact the start of the project. So your client might be delaying an answer or saying yes, or maybe they're switching people around at the company and it just takes longer to get started. So what I like to do is to put how long each stage of the design process is going to take. For each stage, I'd like to explain what the stage is, why we do it, what they can expect from us, and what we're expecting from them. So if we need anything at a certain time, I like to put that here. Letting your client know all these things up front means that it's much easier for them to prepare anything that they need to do, and it's much more likely that the project is actually keeping to the timeline that you were planning out. Last up is the project budget, and I always like to offer a couple options here. If we're just offering one price, we're basically competing against all the other designers. But if we're offering multiple options, we're kind of competing against ourselves. So I think that's super helpful. Let's say, for example, that your client is really interested in branding, but maybe they're a little bit unsure how much they want to spend for their budget. They have a range, but they're interested in seeing what you can offer. In that case, you could do 3 different packages. So the first package could be, let's say, logo design and visual language. The second option, you could add brand strategy. And maybe the third one, you keep everything you did for the first 2 packages, but you also add, let's say, templates or website design, for example. That way your client can see, okay, actually, you know what, strategy sounds like a really good idea. Let's go for the middle option, for example. Once the proposal is ready, I always make sure to spell check it and read it through to make sure everything sounds really good. Then I export it and I send it to my client as a PDF. One of 4 things can happen. Either they can say no, they can push back on price, they can ghost you and not answer, or they can say yes. So let's have a think about what we can do in each of those 4 scenarios. If they say no, that's totally fine. You can say, okay, great, we're not a good fit. Thank you so much for considering working with me. If you ever want to work together in the future, please just let me know. If they push back on price, you can either just say, no, those are my prices, or you can see if you can change the scope, but please don't lower your prices. I know it can be really tempting when you're just starting out, but it's never a good idea for you. Let's say you start working with a client and they start expecting those low prices. It means you can't focus on marketing and getting those real dream clients, but also for the design industry as a whole. If we all start kind of undercutting each other, it just makes it really difficult for everyone. If they ghost you, meaning that they don't answer for, let's say, a couple weeks, then what I like to do is I like to follow up once or twice and just check in, see if they had any questions about the proposal, and if they still haven't answered you, that's totally fine. I would say leave it at that, and then maybe they come back in the future. If they say yes, that's great, then we're ready to move on to the next stage, which is invoicing and design contracts. For the invoicing, I won't say much more than the fact that I think you should charge at least 50% upfront. This means that the client shows that they're invested, and you also have a bit of money that you can use while you work on the project. So it's like a runway for yourself. Every country has really different rules around accounting, so I don't want to give any advice that isn't accurate for you. But in my case, I use an accounting software because it's easy and I have a numbered series of invoices and I can always go back and find the invoice for my client. For the design contract or design agreement, my version is basically a customized and shortened version of the AIGA contract template, so I'll make sure to link that down in the description if you want to go check out the whole one. But I thought I would talk you through the sections I've chosen to include and how I've modified them, just to make sure that you have an idea of something that is great to get started with. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to give you legal advice, but these are basically a really good foundation that have helped me through my 8-9 years of working as a designer. This design contract is something that I created in Adobe InDesign, and when I have a new client, all I do is Command F and I find the client name, and then I just replace that with my new client name. So basically that way it's super easy to update the contract, and then I just have to export it and have them sign it. So the very first section is just an intro saying what the client name is, our legal name, the date and the scope of the project. So maybe it's branding or branding and website design, for example, just to give an outline of what the project is. And this is also good in case you have multiple projects with the same client. Next up, we have a section called work. This section is all about saying that we are the ones who are producing the work, it's original, free of plagiarism, and that we won't outsource the work to someone without telling our client. So this is just a protective clause to show that we are taking responsibility for the work. One key addition that we made ourselves in this area was to make sure that we mention that if something big changes in the company that we're working with, let's say they change their company name halfway through the project, or they change their target audience, for example, we will have to revisit the scope and renegotiate the budget. And we did this because we had a couple projects where the client actually did change the company name halfway through a branding project, and that makes it really difficult. So of course we have to redo a lot of work. The tone of the brand could be different, the actual logo will need to be different, and it felt a little bit awkward to renegotiate the price because we didn't have anything in our contract that said that we couldn't just include it in the original. So we added this just to make sure that we feel comfortable and that everyone's on the same page. Next up, we have a section called confidentiality, and this is basically stating that we understand that we are taking part of information that the client is sharing that they might not want competitors to know about. things like their production process, their marketing strategy, for example. So we are promising that we will not share this information with someone who is not part of this project. Next up is a really quick section called compensation, and this just says that they need to pay the fee that we've agreed upon in the project proposal, and also that we are our own company and we will take care of our own taxes. So some people, they choose to have it where the company that hires you will pay the taxes, so that's something that you'll want to outline depending on how your company is set up and your country's rules. Next up is a section called client approval, and it is actually super important. So basically this is saying that once the client has approved the project, then they are responsible for anything that happens in production processes or anything else after that point. And the reason we've added this is because a lot of our clients, they go on to use the branding and the design assets that we've done for, let's say, exhibition materials or packaging design. We don't have any insight into what actually happens in those printing processes unless we've been brought into that project. And even then, all we have is the communication with the printer. We're not there, foot on the ground, to see what is happening with the printing process and the proofing. So we don't want to be liable if anything goes wrong in that production process. So we basically just state that in case there's any post-production and they have approved the project from us, then that's the end of our responsibility. This is especially important if you're designing things like packaging, so we always include this if we're doing packaging design, because it's really expensive actually to print a large batch of packaging. And let's say you have missed something, like maybe there was something that was a spelling mistake, or there's something else that you've gone through it time and time again and your client has looked at it, but something was missed. Then you want that protection of your client has approved it, then your responsibility is done. Because you don't want to be liable for something that is happening in that production process which makes that packaging unusable. Of course, we always want to be super thorough and we want to have that great relationship with our clients, but we can't control everything. So I always feel more comfortable having this clause in. Next up is cancellation, and this is just saying that both the client and us could cancel the project at any point for any reason. And this is just so that if someone gets ill, if something happens, let's say the client can't pay the whole project, they can cancel it partway through, but we will let them know how far the project has gone and what fees that they owe us for that work up to that point. The last section is ownership, and this is just stating that because they only pay part of the project fee up front, we own the rights to the designs until they've paid in full. And once they've paid in full, they own the rights to the designs. Since we're doing branding, we want the company to own the rights to their own brand, but this can be a little bit different if, let's say, you're an illustrator and you want to do licensing, for example. So that might need a little bit of a different type of contract. To sign the contract, I want to make it super easy for everyone to do it. We don't have to meet in person. Most of the clients that we work with are actually abroad, so I want to make it easy to sign digitally. So what we do is we actually export it as a PDF, and then we use a tool called Signable, a digital tool. It's not sponsored, I just really like their product. And basically what you can do is you can send this out where you sign it and the client signs it. All you have to do is add the different fields for the signatures and the dates. And then once it's signed and approved, you will have the different timestamps of when what happened. And so it's a digital track record of how the design contract was signed, so that you have that in case you need to, for example, go to small claims court if your client isn't paying. The last step before we actually start working on the project, which is really, really important, is to set up a client portal. So don't skimp on this. We personally use Trello for this, and I set up one column for each stage of the design process, and then I use different cards to organize different steps. So I upload the invoice receipt, and I upload the invoice, I upload the signed contract, I upload the proposal, for example, to this section that is for the first stage, which is called Before We Start. This way my client always has access here, and we can have those conversations throughout the project. It doesn't have to get messy with some things happening over email, some things happening over phone. And if your client is emailing or calling you throughout the project, I always just like to add a note that we had that conversation in Trello. So what we came up with and anything that is good to know in the project is then staying in the same hub. So now that your client has paid, signed the contract, and they're on board with the project, we want to make sure that we can learn as much as we possibly can about their business and goals and vision before we start designing, so that what we create will be really targeted and will help them create a really effective brand. This will be the first longer type of connection that the client has with you. So we want to make sure that we do a little bit of research ahead of time. So what I like to do is to read the client's website, or make sure that any material that they have, like a social media profile or a website, we're checking and learning about their business. And I also like to have a quick look at some competitors that I could find. This means that you're a lot more familiar with the industry that your client is in, and you can ask a lot more targeted questions. So it shows that you're really invested in this brand and you want to make sure that you're doing a good job. A really big part of the discovery meeting is being able to ask follow-up questions and really get to the bottom of what a client means when they say something. And this is why I really like to have a meeting, either a digital one or in person, rather than sending, let's say, a questionnaire with different questions about their brand. When we send a form with questions, we're not able to ask, what does this mean to you? When you say feminine, what does that mean? And that means that it's a lot harder for us when we start designing to know which choices we need to make. So having a meeting where you're having that one-to-one connection is really, really important. I have two kind of quick pro tips that I want to bring up before we get into the actual meeting. And this first one is that after you have that initial chit chat that always goes on at the beginning of a meeting, suggest that everyone turns off their camera. Of course, this is if you're having a digital meeting. Because what I've noticed is that, let's say we have a 1.5 to 2 hour meeting, when we're just talking about all these really fundamental questions about a business, if everyone's at the same time thinking about like, am I smiling enough? Can you see my cat in the background? Like, it becomes really, really distracting. So what we say is, make sure that you feel comfortable, have that conversation in the beginning, and then say, okay, we're going to turn off our cameras now. Everyone's going to feel comfortable, and we're just going to focus on your business and your goals. And I found that that makes everyone a lot more comfortable. So that's one pro tip. The second one is to lead the meeting by sharing your screen the whole time. So we're going to talk about what goes into the setup of the meeting, but I think sharing your screen, it means that you can guide your client through each step or each section that you have questions for. And this way you're not getting distracted by, let's say, your client starting to, oh, I'm just going to show you this website from a competitor I thought was interesting, which can get quite derailing of the meeting if you start having those tangents. So leading the meeting through sharing your screen is a really smart choice. To hold a really solid discovery meeting, I think you need 4 things. The first one is a really clear structure that your client understands up front, and then they can follow throughout the meeting. This doesn't only make it clear, but it also makes the meeting not feel as long, because I feel like these meetings tend to take about 2 hours, and that is quite a long time if your client doesn't know what's next. The next up is an engaging format. So if we would just have, let's say, a blank page in front of us as we share a screen and we're typing, that can be quite boring, to be honest. So what I like to do is I like to use tools to set up, let's say, different competitor maps, or to set up, let's say, a collaborative aspect. So I'm going to talk about how to do that a little bit later in this video, but having an engaging format where it feels collaborative, it feels like you're having this exciting insights together, that's a really good thing to think about when you're preparing for your meeting. And the last 2 things you need are a smart way to record everything that's being said, and then for you to be able to take all this information, compile it, and send it to your client. So this can be done in lots of ways, and I'm going to cover those as well. Let's start with the structure of the meeting. So what questions to ask and in what way to ask them. So we need a couple of different things in order to be able to create a brand. First off, we need to know everything about the business and the current brand. How has it performed? Are there things that aren't working, things that are working? How can we improve on it? All these things that will teach us about the company and their vision. This is relevant even if it's a new company, because they might still have ideas of things that they think are important for them. We also really want to understand the goal of the new brand. So is it to build more trust, to reach a new audience, or maybe to fix something like retention in the company, for example? And lastly, we want to understand everything from their customers, their competitors, their offer, all of these different information points that help us design a very intentional brand. So keeping all of this in mind, I like to use this structure for my discovery meetings. The very first section is called Background about your company. And here I like to give my client quite a free rein to just talk about why they started their company, what their vision is, if they have like a mission that really drives them, kind of their origin story, and to get a little bit more personal about why they care about the business, and all these different things that help us get to know the people, but also the business itself. If they've already been running the business for a while, I also like to ask about the current brand. So trying to get really specific with what is not working. Why did you want to do a rebrand? Or maybe asking, what are some things that you actually really like about your brand that you would like to keep? Maybe they really like their logo, but the rest of the brand isn't working. Or maybe they really feel attached to a color in the brand, but the rest of it isn't working. Because all these things are super helpful when we start designing, because otherwise we might get really far down the line and realize, oh, but it doesn't have this color that they liked and they never told us. So asking about all these things up front is super helpful. A new question that I added to this section that has actually been so helpful is to ask them to describe their dream office or dream shop. So even if they never actually plan on having an office or a shop, it's just a mental exercise to think about, like, how do you feel when you come in through the shop? Are you greeted by someone? Is it like an all AI experience? How does it feel? Is it like a wood floor? Is it lots of art everywhere? Is it super bright? Or is it like really colorful? Or what does it feel like? Do you want it to be exciting? Do you want it to be calm? All these different things that people can start to paint up a picture, and you can start to understand how that space would look and feel. And that gives you an idea of the experience that they want to create for their customers through their brand. Next up, I want to talk about their offer. So basically what they're selling. And this is for us to really understand what the business does and understand how they're different. So let's say, for example, they're selling backpacks. Are those backpacks different from all the school backpacks because these are specifically done for hiking and they have compartments specifically made for camping gear, for example? All these different things can help us understand who this product is for and also how they're different from competitors, so that we can lift out these things when we create the brand. A bonus question that you can ask, which can be really helpful, is to ask, what do you want to be known for? Sometimes there's like one feature or one key benefit that they've always felt really proud of. And so asking what they want to be known for, it could be something like a feature, but it could also be something like, we're the highest quality, or we have the best prices, for example, or we're the most sustainable. So asking what they want to be known for can actually be quite revealing. The third section is all about their customers. And this is, for me, the last section I do before we take a break. So I always let my clients know that this is going to be a section we do now, and then after this, we're going to take a break. So for the customers, what I want to find out is everything from demographics to psychographics. So demographics is everything very basic about a person, like their age, their income, or their location, for example. While psychographics are much more in-depth information about why someone chooses to buy something. Like maybe they really align with the mission of the company, or it makes them feel better about themselves, or it's a goal that they have, for example. So we want to understand all these different things about their customers. And because we're going to be doing research after we have the discovery meeting, we also want to have a really good foundation that we can then start building on. But one thing that's really important here is to verify how your client knows this information. Sometimes clients are really sure in their mind who their customer is, but they're going on feeling, not on facts. So let's say they have surveys, website analytics, if they have information about their sales, that's super helpful information because you know that's verified. But if they're saying, well, we meet a lot of people and they seem to be this type of person, that's something you can say, okay, good, that's a great starting point. We're going to do some research and see how that compares to other competitors, for example. When it comes to how to ask these questions, I think you could do it in two structures, and you could also combine them if you'd like. So the first one is to do straight personas. So here we start by asking all the basic demographic information, and then we can go into things like, what are their interests, who influences them to buy, how does they want the brand to make them feel, all these questions that can be really insightful. Or you can do more of a buyer kind of user journey. So let's say they have a problem, they Google how to solve it, they find your website, they browse your products, pick one, so forth, and see which decisions that they make at each step of the process there. So that can be quite insightful for understanding the psychology behind someone buying something. A benefit of using a buyer journey is that it will actually reveal a lot of the brand touch points to you. So let's say that they talk about their website, their packaging, and their customer support. Then that's something you need to think about. How is the brand going to work in all of those different instances? And that means that when you're presenting, let's say, mock-ups, you can be hyper specific and show, here's what your brand will look like on this packaging that we talked about. If your client has really different types of audiences that they sell to, but they all fit into their business, you might want to urge them to create a couple different personas. And here it might get a little bit tedious. Let's say you have 3 personas and quite a lot of questions for each. You might want to take a break in between a couple just to make sure that people don't feel like it's repeating and doing all this work over and over again. The next section is competitors and inspiring brands. And here I want to make sure that I'm asking both about direct competitors and indirect competitors. So let's say I'm designing for an ice cream brand. A direct competitor would be like other ice cream brands, but indirect competitors might be other snacks like cookies or candies or froyo, for example. So I want to make sure that we ask them about, okay, do you know who your competitors are, which feel like indirect, which feel like direct competitors. And you could also ask them follow-up questions like, which of these would you say is the closest to your audience? Which one of them do you really like the brand of? And is there something we could use from these brands that you would like to incorporate in your own, for example? The last and maybe most important section from our design works perspective is how might we questions. So if you're familiar with design sprints, they usually start off with how might we questions. And these are questions that are basically going to be the goal of the branding project. So instead of just having this kind of more vague definition of we want to create a nice brand or an effective brand, we want to get really specific for this one client. So for example, how can we create a brand that tells our story better? Or how can we create a brand that is targeting this new audience better? So having these really specific questions will basically mean that when we show concepts or when we show anything, we can point back and say, this is why we created this concept, because it's solving the how might we question. You can have quite a few. I think the more you have, of course, the more different targets you're trying to hit. So I always like to encourage us to have between 1 and maybe 5 or 6, just so it doesn't get too scattered. But it's no problem to have more than one because it still gives you an idea of the things that matter to your clients. So now that we know the actual sections that we're going to include in our discovery, we want to get back to those other things that matter, which is to have a really clear and engaging way to run the meeting and an easy way for you to record and then share this information with your clients. And I think this is where really helpful digital tools come in. There are so many great tools that can help you collaborate in a visual way when you're having a remote meeting, but you can use them when you're having a meeting in person as well. And just let's say have your computer out, or if there's a TV that you can have your computer connected to, that's also a really great way of doing it. I use an app called Olibrief because it is actually specifically created for discovery meetings and creating joint briefs. And I'm able to set up different sections that my client can get a clear overview of the different sections we're going to cover. And then I can type and fill in these sections as we go through the discovery meeting. So for example, when I talked about competitors before, I showed you this competitor map where we have the direct competitors as the kind of A circle, and then we have the more indirect competitors further and further away from the middle. And having these kind of visual cues that can feel a lot more collaborative, it makes the meeting run a lot more smoothly in my experience. There's also lots of great tools like InVision or Miro, for example, that let you do more of like a drag and drop, or different people can write things simultaneously. You can do more of like a design sprint format where, let's say, everyone takes 2 minutes in silence to write how might we questions, and you can all put them up on the board. Which tools you choose are mostly up to your own preferences and the way that you like to work. So do you want it to feel super collaborative and visual, or do you want it to feel like a very structured document? It really is up to you. So maybe test out a couple and run like a little trial run, like a tech run with one of your friends, and see which one you prefer. If you want to stick with the tools you have, and especially if budget is a concern, that you don't want to pay for anything, you can also create really nice presentation setups with questions and areas to fill in, let's say, Keynote or PowerPoint, for example. I did that for the first 5 years of my business and it worked great. It was just a little bit more work setting it up in the first place, but I created a template for that and then I could just fill it in for each new meeting. Once you have the discovery document all prepared, make sure that you add it to the client portal that we created last time. This means that both you and the client can always find it super quickly. To make it a little bit easier to follow along, I thought we would design this for a fictional brand. So I decided that we're going to create this for an urban garden called Rootful. Their goal is to have a space for people who live in a city to come and meet and build community, to have a way for them to eat more locally produced vegetables, but also to learn about our food production and how to be more sustainable overall. We're actually, as a family right now, trying to grow all of our own vegetables ourselves. So this will be a really fun exercise for me as well, and a way to learn a little bit more about urban gardens. Last time in the discovery meeting, we talked to our clients about their customers, their vision, and other brands that they feel inspired by. Today, our job is to look at trends and opportunities in this market and see what we can use when we create the brand ourselves. The first step is to conduct the brand research, and I like to break this up into a couple different steps. First, I like to look into similar companies, both competitors that my clients have mentioned, but also companies that I think could be a competitor that maybe they missed. First, I visit their website and I look for a few different things. I like to see how they use design to convey information, like for example what photography they use, how they use layout and colors, and maybe if they use illustrations or infographics, for example. I also look at their logo. I take screenshots of everything and I add them to Milanote, so I have a place to collect all of my research. You can also use the Milanote extension to grab the images directly and put them into a board. The next thing I look for on the websites is messaging. How do they pitch their business? How is the tone? Is it friendly and casual or formal and to the point, for example? This tells us both what information that they think their customers care about, but also how they like to be spoken to. If a lot of competitors are using the same approach, we need to ask ourselves if it's because it's really working or maybe because people are a little bit worried to step away from the norm. So in some cases, it can be an industry where you can disrupt and you can come up with a completely different approach, and that can work great. But in some industries, let's say for example you're a lawyer, you might not want to have a super happy, fun-go-lucky tone. Or if you're an ice cream shop, you might not want to be super duper serious. So sometimes these tones work because they are for a specific industry with an audience who is expecting something. But try to look into it and analyze if what competitors are doing is the smart choice or something that could be disrupted. Next up, I do the same thing on social media. I focus on the social media platforms that my client has decided to use, and also that seems like the best fit for the audience. In the case of Rootful, I think TikTok and YouTube might be the best platforms since we're trying to reach people who want growing tips, probably in video format, and also who want quick updates about what's actually happening in this urban garden so they can come visit and take part. Now that we know a little bit more about the competitors and we have these images and screenshots to draw from, I like to start adding them to my report as I go. So I add in the images from the different competitors and I make little notes of takeaways and things we can learn. So for example, things I think they did really well or things I think could be opportunities that we could use for our own brand. This report uses a template that I've created, so the sections are always more or less the same. After the research meeting with my client, I send them this report and that way they can always look back and see what we came up with, but it also works as the foundation for the concepts that we will design. Next up is brands that appeal to the same audience. So they're not in the same industry, but they share the same audience as the brand we're designing for. I do the exact same thing of visiting their website and social media, and I write down things that I observe. For Rootful, the audience is millennials who live in the city and want a break from their busy day-to-day lives. It can either be someone who works really long hours and want a hobby or a place to visit that is really relaxing, or it could be families with young kids, for example, that want a place for them to play and spend time together, maybe with other parents as well. So keeping this in mind, I think brands with a similar audience might be things like really kid-friendly cafes, yoga places, libraries, other places where these people would spend their time that would be more of what we call the third space. So not home or work, but a third space where people are willing to meet in their free time. Next up, we want to look at trends and design styles that are happening in this industry. And I would say that this part of the research is probably the least straightforward. There are lots of different ways to do this, and you have to spend some time trying to find different answers, digging around a little bit, following a couple different paths and see what you come up with. Think of it a bit like if you were a journalist and you were following different sources to see the whole picture in the story. So let's give it a try. On Google Scholar, I might search for trends for urban farms, for example, and see if we can find something. Okay, so here's a really interesting paper that looks at what those living in cities care about when they decide for or against supporting an urban farm. Scientific papers, they can seem a little bit intimidating, but there's a couple different things you can look out for to make sure that you find a good scientific study. The first one is the sample size. So if you have very few people or very few different organizations who took part, that means that the sample size was really small and it's harder to make any kind of deductions from it. So the more people who participated, the more data you have to actually make conclusions from. It can also be a good idea to see when it was published. So you actually have different filters in Google Scholar where you can make sure that you're finding something that is from the last couple of years and maybe not a study on urban farms from the 80s, for example, because that might not be as relevant right now. Start with the abstract and see if there's any information that might be interesting in this particular study. Right away, I can see that we mention a couple different reasons that people want to support urban farms, like having more food security, when we see stronger effects from global warming and higher food prices. And this is super interesting and something that we can point out when we suggest designs and messaging for the brand. I want to learn a bit more, so I'll go down to the results and discussion section. This is where they talk about what they found and what that means. First off, we can see that a big part of the audience is a similar age to our customers, so that's really good. And we can also see there are two factors that are key for adopting urban farms, and those are confidence and pleasantness. It might just be me, but I want to understand what those things mean because I think they can have a lot of different meanings. So I'm just going to click Command F and write confidence to read their definition, because most scientific papers always define all of the different terms that they use. And then I do the same for pleasantness. It seems like confidence is how confident you feel that you can take part, both financially and from a time perspective. So when we think about how we can apply this to the brand, we might want the brand assets to show how easy it is to be involved, offering ways to get involved that are casual and not a continuous commitment, for example. For pleasantness, it's more about how nice the environment is to be around. So something we can put in our research report could be that we need to showcase the really pretty parts of the garden and how well adapted the garden is for smaller kids, for example. I add all this to my report and I make sure to add the source. So you can do this in a couple different ways. You could either link it directly in the text, or you could have a reference list at the end of the document. This is what I tend to do, and then I just add a quick reference to the author's name and the year it was published in the actual main text. And then at the end of the document, I add a reference list. I use the Harvard method, so there's different methods of citing, and a really quick way to do this is just to use a tool called Cite This For Me. Here you just add in the website link or a book ISBN or the article DOI number, for example, and then it creates both the text and full reference for you, so that is super quick. Next, I just do a basic Google search for trends in urban farming and see what different paths we can find that we could go down. I'm looking for articles or even trend reports that will tell me why people want to join an urban garden, and this is also a great place to find images for my mood boards. I can see that hydroponics are becoming much more popular for urban farms, but it's not exactly what we're after because Rootful doesn't really have hydroponic systems as part of their garden. I can see a couple farms that seem a bit more similar to Rootful, so I'll visit those websites and see what they say. Yeah, okay, so we can see that these are both very focused on community and creating this garden together. To see how this fits in with our millennial audience, we can see if we can find articles or reports that talk about the role of community for millennials. We're looking for articles that feel like they come from very credible sources, and I also like to check out a couple different ones before I form a kind of conclusion about what I think. This is why it's really important to have time to do the research and not feel like you have to quickly rush to find something, but make sure you have the time to browse and really take your time with it. I can see that online communities are important to millennials, but I can't see articles that directly talk about in-person communities. I do see that millennials are much more likely to live alone than older generations, so perhaps there's more of a need for community. And to find out, I see if I can find articles that talk about loneliness and see what they say about millennials. Okay, so millennials are reporting that they're likely to have only a few friends or no close friends, and a lot more people live by themselves. So this could be a great opportunity to show how the urban garden can be a place where you belong, and I think we need to be careful not to make it seem like you have to be a really expert gardener to partake. If you want to look for trends in search terms, a few great places to look are Pinterest Trends and Google Trends. This will show you what terms people use to find different urban gardens or home growing, and it can give us some idea of how the messaging can work. For example, we can see that urban green space has gone up with 150% in search in the last 12 months. We can also see on Pinterest trends that cottage garden, meaning these cute gardens with lots of flowers and garden aesthetics, are both up in search a lot. This could tell us that people really care about having a space that's really cozy to spend time in and kind of reinforces this pleasantness factor that we saw from the scientific paper. So now that we've done a bit of research, we can draw 3 different conclusions, I think. First off, people want an urban garden that looks really nice and that they enjoy spending time in. 2 is that community is a great way to draw in millennials who want to feel part of something and don't want to feel lonely. And 3, it should feel really easy to get involved. You shouldn't feel like there's a monthly commitment or a weekly commitment or like you have to be an expert to be involved. You should be able to just drop by and enjoy the garden. With this in mind, I want to collect a bunch of inspiration that I can use for my mood boards. So I look on Pinterest, Unsplash, Dribbble, Behance, and in books that I have in my library. For a typical project, I like to spend about 2 days collecting information, so this is obviously a super shortened version, but I hope that I can give you a good idea of how to approach the brand research stage. I already have an idea in mind that we would want one mood board to feel a bit more like a charity and focused on community, one that is more focused on the kind of cottage core, cozy aesthetic, and one that is perhaps a bit more like botanical and focuses on bringing in illustrations of plants, but I don't want to get more specific than that before I've had a look at some designs and see where my mind goes. When I look for images, I try to find a nice mix of different applications. So in this case, I know they will need a logo, a website, social media templates, and signage in the actual garden. So I want to find examples for all of these if I can. I also think photography is such an important part, so I want to find at least 1 or 2 images that can guide each mood board. As I find things, I just use the Milanote extension to add the images to my overall mood board, and then I'll sort and put it all together later. I want the stage to be really free and just creative, and a space for us to just look for inspiration without feeling like you have to be creating already. Okay, great, so now we have lots of different inspiration images that we can use. Now I want to go into Milanote and divide them up to the 3 separate mood boards, so I can make sure that I have enough images to work with once we start designing. You could definitely do just one mood board, but I find that it's quite nice to have 3 different mood boards, or at least more than one, so that you can explore some different directions at this super early stage when the stakes are a lot lower. So I like to have either a safe, a medium, and maybe a slightly more adventurous mood board, or 3 different directions that I think could all be interesting but that are super different, so that we can look together with our client and see, actually, surprisingly, this direction works really well, let's explore that. So this stage is supposed to be really playful and we really want to be exploring different options. You could definitely make the mood board straight in Milanote, but I like to use the pen tool and add text and other details to make the mood boards feel a little bit more like the images are all from the same brand, so I personally like to make them in Illustrator. I make the mood boards the same size as my Keynote pages because I'll put all of my key research findings and the mood boards all into one presentation that I can share with my client during the meeting. I usually try to start with the colors for each mood board, and this way there's a clear kind of visual direction and I can see how they differ from each other. I also want to make sure that the typography has clear direction, so if I really like one of the images but the typography is really different from the other ones in the same mood board, I might block out that area and add text myself. The goal is for each mood board to have a really distinct direction, so we want to make sure that everything matches and feels like it could fit into the same brand. Another good idea at the mood board stage can be to look into stock illustrations or graphics that you can use, because this means that you don't need to spend all this time making something just for the mood board, but you can still get that feeling that you're after. So now I think we're at a point where I'm gonna actually say that I'm done with these mood boards. I feel like you can always keep going and find new things you want to tweak, but I'm gonna be happy with this. So for the first one, we've gone for a much more modern vibe, and the idea here is to make it feel like a place for young people to come, people who want it to be kind of like inspired by museums and cool cafes. So I wanted to have that direction in there in case that's something my client wants to pursue. The second one is a lot more around botanicals, a much softer vibe where we have illustrations and it feels like layering and almost a little bit like kind of scrapbooking, where it feels like the garden is more natural and grows a little bit at its own pace. And so here we really want to create this calm feeling of a place that you can come to when you need a bit of time. For the third one, I wanted to be a bit more of this cottagecore feeling, and here I wanted it to be lots of flowers, colors, like you have fun picnics and lots of really fun events where you can bring your kids, and there's always a lot of energy and movement. I've used these more playful illustrations here and this little dotted line to kind of create more of a DIY feel to make it feel a little bit less intimidating. Once I feel comfortable with my 3 mood boards, I add them into my keynote. Here I also add the key takeaways from my research. The client will get the full research report after the meeting, but I just want to discuss a few key takeaways that we can incorporate into the brand. So the presentation could look something like this. We cover what the competitors look like, opportunities for their own brand, visual trends, trends and psychology for their audience, and lastly the mood boards. I also like to show the how might we questions that we came up with in the discovery and make suggestions for how we can solve them. For example, if one of the how might we questions for Rootful was, how might we create a brand that encourages new people to visit the garden? My response could be to focus on how easy it is to join in and using really aesthetic images to show how lovely the garden is. How much information you put really is down to the scope of the project. If, let's say, you're creating a website and social media templates, then you might want to include examples from competitors or from their own current brand where you point out opportunities, for example. During the meeting with my client, I take them through each slide of the presentation one by one and discuss what we found. I make a note of any preferences that they have and any other findings that maybe they have to add that we can then put into the research report or look into further. When I present the mood boards to my client, I make sure that they understand that although these are curated directions specifically made for them, we have not designed anything uniquely. This is all a collection of things that already exist in the market. And this is just for us to make sure that we're understanding the visual direction that they are interested in taking. Because although these are all curated, we still want to make sure they feel really excited about their own brand. So personal taste and preference does come in a little bit. They can like one of the mood boards really strongly, or they can like different bits and pieces from them so that we can create a really dynamic concept that will take into consideration the different things that they're interested in. A really key thing here is to always ask why. So if your client, for example, really likes a logo, you can say, really good, perfect, that's helpful to know. Why do you like that logo? Is it the color? Is it the typography? Is it the lockup? Is it like that it feels really playful or really dynamic? Try to get to the bottom of why, because if you end up with just a collection of things that they like, but you're not quite sure why, it's really difficult to use that as a guide when you're creating your own concepts. We also want to let them know that dislikes are just as helpful as likes. So we don't want them to tiptoe around anything just to make sure they're not hurting our feelings, because we want to know everything, all what they like and all what they don't like. After the meeting, I add in any last information to the research report and I export the keynote to a PDF. And then I add both of these documents to the client portal. My first step when I create concepts is to try to look at the mood board and free associate ideas that I could think of that might be appropriate for the brand. In this case, I was thinking about these beautiful garden gates that have really ornate designs and how maybe we can create a design for a logo icon with a simple version of these. I like it because a door feels very inviting and it would be a really good way to bring in leaves and flowers in the icon. I use sites like Pinterest, Unsplash and Pexels to find reference images, and I add it all into Mila notes so that I can refer back to it when I sketch. I'm also going to create illustrations that are a lot more realistic today, so I'm going to take you through how to do that, and I want to have images that I can use as reference. And I really do want to consider copyright here. I always use images that I have rights to when I use them as reference, like through Envato licenses or a site like Unsplash, just to make sure I'm not infringing on anyone's copyright. Okay, great, so now we have our different references and I'm going to start sketching ideas for my logos. I work in Procreate because that's where I illustrate and I'm really comfortable, but if you prefer, you can sketch on pen and paper or even in Illustrator if that's something you're comfortable with. I try to not get too stuck on one idea, so I started working on the different layouts for the door, but then I always want to try out other ideas, like maybe creating a handwritten word mark, for example. Since we want this urban garden to feel very inviting and friendly, I think maybe a more hand-lettered word mark could work really well. Try to focus on where in the word that you have empty space. Like in this one, you have space above the O's because the capital R and the T are both higher up. And then see if you can add in details or customize the letters to create a more balanced design. I also have this idea of a few vegetables or maybe flowers coming together to create more of like a stamp effect. Kind of like what you would see if you would use lino cut or stamp as a design. It brings a bit more texture, and I think it could work really well with this more organic design style. My problem here is that it's just not very visible at small sizes, so I need to find a way to make the design much clearer and maybe a little bit simpler, but I don't want to lose the personality. Okay, so I have an idea. I want to see if we can use the flower that I quite like and maybe combine it with a shovel to create an icon. Okay, I do really like that, and I think this might be the direction that we're gonna go in. It could be a hint that the work that you put into the garden helps you flourish and makes your community better. Before I finalize the mark, I want to try a few different flower designs, and I think this one with the more pointy ends works best. My last step before I move to Illustrator is just to clean up the design so it's easier for me to create a vector from, and I also want to make sure that I create a solid version so that I can just make sure that the idea still works. Perfect, so now that we have our concept, I want to move into Adobe Illustrator and create a vector version, and that's just so that the logo can be scaled infinitely without becoming pixelated. In Illustrator, I try to use the Shape Builder tool and the Pathfinder to break my design into geometrical shapes and then customize them by adding or subtracting parts. I feel like this makes it easier to be precise rather than if I would use the pen tool, because I can just never make a circle as perfect as the circle tool. You kind of have to try your way forward here and just make sure that your logo is visible at small sizes so you can zoom in and out. Just make sure that all your lines and negative space tend to be kind of similar so that it feels really balanced and you don't have one area that's super thin and some that are super thick. When you have different shapes that overlap, it can be quite helpful to use Command Y to show the outlines of your shapes, and then when you want to go back, you just click Command Y again. Just keep tweaking your design, and sometimes it can be a really good idea to just take a break, get a bit of a fresh perspective, and then come back and see, okay, is it balanced? What can I improve? What can I tweak? Before I move forward, I want to check to make sure there's not another logo design that already exists that looks super similar to what I've just created. So I use a database called WIPO Global Brand Database, and here you can search for logos that look similar by just uploading your own image. It's kind of like TinEye, but for copyright. I can't see anything similar, so let's continue. Next up, I want to find a font that will work well with my icon. In some cases where I'm not sure if I will have an icon, I might start with the typeface, but in this case, I felt like the icon would guide the design. I usually start with the fonts I've already installed because they tend to be the ones that work well and that I've kind of pre-vetted before. In this case, I'm thinking that we want a serif, maybe display font, with a lot of character. If we choose a sans serif, I think the logo could feel a bit too like hipster or modern, but we need it to be a little bit of a heavier weight to work well with the mark, so it doesn't feel unbalanced. I'm not quite finding what I want from my library, so I'm looking on Envato Elements, and I actually think I found a font that could work really well for like the small text that goes around a badge and for little details. If we look back to the mood board, having these badges and kind of a more retro style was a big element, so I do want to give that a try. Okay, yeah, I do really like that. I think many of these retro typefaces have kind of a heavy hand texture, but that could make it quite hard to read at small sizes, and I also don't want it to feel too retro, so I'm going to use a solid version. I also found a font that I really like for the word mark. I have an idea to connect the T and the F, so I'm going to give that a try, because at this stage I'm just trying things out and seeing what works best. I actually won't finish this one because I think it just becomes too complicated and the line is a little bit too thin, but it was worth a try. I always put all of my little experiments as a small version up in the top corner of my board, so I can always come back to them if maybe I have an idea later or I think of a way to maybe tweak them. So I would say never delete things that you've tried, because you never know if you want to use them. So now that we have the icon, the stamp and the word mark, I want to start building out the different lockups of the logo and the slogan, and I'm noticing that the text in the circle, it feels a little bit dense, and it means that it's a bit competing with the word mark and it's a bit harder to read. I'm going to try to make the tracking, so the space between all the letters, much wider, and that way we'll be able to make the text a bit smaller, but still cover the same area. That looks a lot better, so I'm going to apply that to the stamp as well. Okay, nice. So now we can create the lockup and then we can move on to colors. Since I picked out these colors for the mood board and they're not taken from another brand, I like to use them as a starting point. But I do feel a bit like this green might be a bit too dark and maybe it gives a bit too much of a serious feeling. I do like the coral and the beige, but I think the yellow also needs to be adjusted a little bit. The last thing before we move on to the illustration is to look at photography. And photography, I think, can really make or break the brand, especially when you present it to your client. I think having their new logo on a photo that gives the right feeling can really bring home a design when you're presenting it. Okay, so now let's have a look at how to create a more realistic illustration. I'm going to share a time lapse of my Procreate illustration and I'm going to talk you through it so you can see every step that I go through in every pencil brush stroke. I want to draw this pea pod because it has a really nice green color that I think will work really well with the brand. You can see the reference image that I've put up in the top corner, and I try to break it into basic shapes as I draw and look at what shapes I can see rather than assume what they should look like. So for example, the peas are actually quite square rather than round because they all have to fit into that pod, so they've all been a bit squeezed. I start with the base color and then I add shadows and lighting, and you really have to hang in there and trust the process because it always looks quite terrible in the beginning. Just keep looking at where the shadows and the light is and add and remove as you go. I like to put everything on its own layer so that I can make a shadow more or less intense with opacity rather than having to redo a whole section. So here it is, it's a pea pod. So let's start using it in our design. I think it would be nice to create a section on the website to talk about growing your own food, and I think the illustration works really nicely with the font as well. The black text is a little bit harsh, so I'm going to use a green text instead to create a bit more of a friendly feeling. I also wanted to show that even if you're not an illustrator and you work as a brand designer and want to use illustration, there are so many good stock illustrations that you can use, so I'm going to work with some of those as well in this video. Another great tip if you're a brand designer and you don't illustrate is to team up with an illustrator and create a joint process. I think it's a really good way to get more work as well because you can both bring projects to each other and it's really fun to collaborate. I also want to finalize my fonts, and I think it's really important to have a font for the main text that is really easy to read. We want to keep in mind people have maybe a form of color blindness or maybe not see as well as other people, so the text should be really visible. Now comes a really fun part. I'm going to start applying the visual language to create Instagram posts as a way to show my client how this brand can be applied, because the practical application will be a really big decision factor for them. I quite like the idea of having an image treatment that feels a bit like scrapbooking because it fits nicely with the mood board, but it also feels a bit like you're making memories. At this point, if you feel like it's easy to design, that usually means that you have a clear brand and that all of your fonts and colors work well together. If you're finding it hard to use, have a think about what changes that you can make to the brand assets so it will be easy for both you and the client to apply the brand in the future. So here is the Rootful brand. I had so much fun creating this brand, and I would love to hear from you if you want to see more work on illustration here. I like to use Keynote to prepare my presentations, and that way I can set up a template so it's much quicker every time I need to do a new project. The goal of the concept presentation is to take this concept that you've created in your head and then show that to your client so they can really understand the vision and how it will be practically applied day to day. Most clients are maybe not super visual people, and that's probably why they hired you as a designer. And so that's why we want to use aids like mock-ups and different examples in photography and show different brand applications so that we're not just showing a logo in black and white, for example, because that's something that will be really difficult for your client to actually picture how that will work in their day-to-day branding. A common pitfall that a lot of concept presentations have is to not talk about the reasoning and the idea behind the concept. So if we just show the visual, we're not really telling the story of the brand. So here's how I structure my concept presentations to make sure I get this vision across and that I'll be able to get helpful and actionable feedback from my clients. The very first slide I have is just an intro stating what the meeting is and the core purpose of the meeting. And for me, that means picking a direction for the brand. I always present 3 different concepts to my clients, but if you're presenting one concept, your goal might not be to choose a direction. It might be something like revealing the brand identity and making it iterations before we move to launch of the brand. Next, I explain all the different sections that we're going to go through and just tell my client what to expect. I want them to be aware of everything they're going to be seeing and that they'll see lots of different applications. But this is also where I ask them to wait with their feedback until we've shown all the different concepts. It's really difficult to give good feedback before you've seen all the different applications. And if you decide to have feedback after each concept, which definitely is a helpful strategy as well, I've noticed that sometimes those comments are just not as valid after they see the next concept. So let's say you're presenting the 3 different ones and they have lots of comments on each, but actually they notice that the third one is the clear winner. Then you might not really have had to have all those comments on 1 and 2 because they're going to be out anyway. So I like to tell my client that I'm going to present all 3 concepts, and then we can have comments and we can go back and forth and we can have a discussion together about the concepts to see which direction they want to go with. The last section I have before I show my work are a few slides that just recap the project goals and explain what to look out for in a good logo. Design can be so subjective, and we want to set the right tone and make sure that our clients think about their customers rather than their own taste. So now we can dive into presenting each concept. I always start with the core idea behind the concept, and this will set the tone and show my client that I've listened and taking their goals into consideration. Keeping this in mind, we can now start presenting the logo. I usually have 4 different slides for the logo. The first one is just a mark in black on a white background. Next, I show the variations with black and white, and here I can mention if we made any tweaks to make sure that the white version is optically similar to the black on white version. Then I move on to color variations. I then include a slide that shows the dynamic aspects of the brand. For some, it can be a fully dynamic brand where the colors and shapes of the logo change to fit different departments or areas of the business. But for some, it's more about showing the icon and different lockups of the logo. Now that I've covered the logo, I present the colors and the fonts. And here, I think it's really important to explain how they will actually be used. Now that we covered the basics of the visual language, I dive into more in-depth sections like illustrations, photography, social media templates, and any other applications that I think will be really relevant to this brand. If the project includes print, packaging, or maybe a website design, I always try to include at least 1 applications of each of these as well, just to give my client an idea of how this will work day to day. For each application, take some time to find mockups that will really tie in well with your client's business, and that's going to show how the brand practically works much better. When I present multiple concepts, I always make sure that both the sections that I include, but also the exact mockups are the same for each concept, because that's going to make it so much easier for my client to actually compare and look at the visuals that we've created rather than the mockups that we picked. The very last slide is always just the logos of the different concepts, just to kind of jog their memory and give us a place to start the discussion. When I've taken my client through the whole presentation, my first question is always, which direction do you lean towards the most? This will give us a really positive starting point to start having discussions about things that they feel really strongly about, like positive or negative, and it will be really good to start narrowing down which direction we're going overall. We typically go through the presentation back and forth and review all the concepts again and start having those questions and discussions that my client has maybe been writing down during the meeting. If they love everything right away, that's perfect, but don't be afraid to ask if there are any areas that you need to work on, because it's much better to do that now rather than when you've exported everything, created the full brand guide, and then you realize, oh, actually this color doesn't work. So make sure you ask those questions now. If they have multiple people on their team, make sure that you act as the translator if they have different opinions. So let's say one person really likes concept 1 and one person really likes concept 2. Get them to really distill down what they like about those concepts and see if there's any crossover. So maybe you realize that the reason they love concept 1 is just because of the colors, but actually everything else about concept 2 is stronger. So then you can have a discussion about, okay, do we need to keep concept 2 as the main direction, but maybe bring in some color options from option 1. So try to be the translator there and help them verbalize what they're feeling around the design. After the meeting, I upload this concept presentation to my client portal in Trello, And I also send them an email that summarizes all of the different changes that we've decided together that we're going to make to the brand before it's finished. If you have misunderstood anything, your client will catch that right away, and that saves a lot of time for everyone. I personally offer 3 rounds of revisions because I want to give the space for my client to really get the brand that they want, and I make sure I put that space in my budget so I can offer a really great brand experience without having to push them on budget each time. Once your client has approved all the new changes, then it's time to export all the files and create the brand guide. When I export the files, I want to make it really easy for my client to actually use the different files and know what the different files are for. So what does this whole setup actually look like? For my logo files, for example, I start with a folder that's just called logo. Inside that folder, I have 2 more folders, print and digital use. In the print folder, I have a PDF version in CMYK for each color variation, and I also have a JPEG version in CMYK for each color variation. And the last thing I add is an Adobe Illustrator file set up in CMYK with all of the different color variations, one in each artboard. For the digital folder, I do the same thing with PNG and SVG files, and sometimes EPS, in different color variations, and I also include an Adobe Illustrator document in RGB. I also usually make a folder specifically for social media, just to make it really easy for them to not have to second guess which color combination or which icon to use. If I know that the brand will be used at really different scales, like a business card and a giant billboard, for example, I might also create different file sizes so that they have those options. And this is mostly for print, because for digital use, you're not going to need as wide of a scale of different file sizes. To actually create all these files, you can go about it in lots of different ways, but there are 2 ways that I've been doing it. One way is to set up an Illustrator document with as many artboards as you have logo variations, and then export them into the right file formats like JPEG or PNG. Because I provide the Illustrator file anyway, this has been the way that I've done it in a lot of my projects, but there is actually a much faster way that I learned about recently. You actually have an export window in Illustrator where you can just drag in your logo and then choose the file format, and you can also add multiple file sizes. This is super handy when you want to export all the different versions separately, like maybe the icon, the word mark, and the full lockup with the slogan, for example. The only thing here I'm actually not 100% sure of is what the resolution is. My best guess is that it chooses the resolution that my document is set up in, but many times you might want to have a lower resolution rather than, let's say, 300 dpi, especially for digital use. So I would love to hear in the comments if you know what resolution the export window uses. I then do the exact same process for any assets like illustrations, patterns, and icons, and then we upload all the files to a cloud folder that I can share with my clients really easily at a later stage. When my client has actually paid the final invoice, I share this folder through the brand guide with them by clicking share and then setting the share setting to anyone with the link can view. The reason I use these settings is that my client might actually want to share this folder with someone on their team, or a marketing person, a web developer, or someone else who might need access. And in that case, I want them to also be able to access it, so I don't want to share just with the specific emails. I want it to be anyone with a link. But on the other hand, I don't want to set them as an editor, because an editor can delete files. And if you have an external person who comes in for a project and accidentally deletes a lot of files, that could be a lot on your plate to find those files on your hard drives and upload them again. So I just make sure I set this setting to view. Okay, great. So now that we have all these assets to go, I'm going to start creating the brand guide. The goal of the brand guide is both to help show my clients how to use the brand day to day, but also to show the values and anything else around the brand that will be helpful for a third party they might bring in, like a marketer, for example. The sections can vary a little bit depending on the business, but I usually include a couple of pages about the brand values, tone of voice, and the idea behind the brand. Sometimes I work with a copywriter, and then this section on brand tone and messaging might be a lot longer, but if I'm creating it myself, I'm not a copywriter, so I tend to focus on what we've come up with in the brand research and discovery session. After this intro section, I add guidance on how to use each part of the brand. If we just add the colors, for example, but we don't explain which ones are background colors, which ones are used for buttons, and which ones are just part of illustrations, for example, it will become really difficult for anyone besides ourselves to actually use the brand. For logos, it can be a good idea to explain when to use which version, and I like to show examples rather than just explaining through text. You can also include sections on the brand photography style and give examples of attributes to look out for in a branded photo. For example, for the Rootful brand, we might want to focus on photography of gardening in action and the outdoors rather than, let's say, vegetables being photographed in more of a studio environment. And we can also make notes about inclusion and color palettes or anything else that will help us create that cohesive brand identity. The next section is perhaps the most prescriptive, and this is where I include social media templates and any layout formatting for a website, packaging, or print that we might have created. If you have packaging, for example, you usually want to have a template where each flavor or new product has roughly the same layout and placement for the logo and text, but the colors and the graphics might change. If I have the time and the budget, I also like to add a page on aspirational examples. This could be adding the branding to merchandise or storefront, for example, if I know that this is something my client will eventually want to do. This is a great way for you to inspire your client, but it can also be a great way for you to get more work in the future because you're showing them all these different applications that you're capable of doing that they might actually be interested in. Here's a really neat tip that I started doing recently. Remember how we uploaded all of the brand files to the cloud earlier? Now I can link each of these folders in my brand guide. This way, anyone who needs a certain brand asset, like a logo or a pattern, they can just find the direct link and download them from the brand guide. Lastly, I export the brand guide as a PDF, and now we're going to create the handoff package where all of this is going to go together to wrap up the project. A handoff package is just a really nice way to give your client everything they need from the project, but also to say thank you and encourage them to work with you more in the future. I like to keep it really simple and just include a quick thank you and a personal note about why it was really fun to work on this project together. Then I have links to download the brand guide and the different brand files, and I finally add a link to leave a testimonial on my Google My Business page. This makes it super easy for you to get testimonials, and it also helps improve your SEO. The final section is a list of services that we offer. And if I work with a brand on a very extensive project and there isn't an obvious next step, this might be a list of general services that I offer in case they're interested. If I have something in mind that I think would be a really good fit. Let's say we worked on their brand and I know their next step is to focus more on their marketing, but we already designed their templates. I might talk about maybe a newsletter or their email signature or other ways that we can work on maybe a retainer to create assets for them. So this is a really good way to show, hey, I really enjoyed this project. It was a great relationship. I'd love to keep it going. Here are some ways that we can keep working together. The very last step is just to send this handoff package to my client and say a big thank you for a nice project. And that's a wrap for this whole series on creating a brand from scratch. I thought it might be really nice to make the next series about how to run your business day to day, like how to get new clients, how to think about finances, and maybe how to set goals for your business. So if you have any thoughts on what kind of videos you would like to see from me, I would love to see those in the comments. If you want to learn more about branding and you really enjoy these deep dives, have a look at this video where I created a brand from scratch for a kids clothing brand. That was a really fun one. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your projects and see you next time.